event, so we can get on today. But it gives me great pleasure to welcome Merlin Hanbury-Tenison. And back in February, I reached out to him when I was on holiday in Cornwall and had a wonderful day visiting the project that you'll hear about, this Kabila farm in Cornwall, and the importance of the forest there, and Merlin's efforts to restore both that forest and the surrounding landscape that you'll hear more about today. And after the event, we have informal drinks reception that you're all welcome to linger for, and also the copies of Merlin's book that are available for purchase and signing as well afterwards. So thanks for joining us, Merlin. Over to you.
Well, thank you so much to the Biodiversity Network and to Advinda for inviting me here today. Thank you to Cole's Books, to Nigel at the back for coming and bringing copies of my book, which I'd be delighted if anyone's interested after this to scribble anything in them that you'd like. I'm a huge supporter of, I try to be as big a supporter as I can be of our independent bookstores. They're going through a tough time at the moment. Never buy a book from Amazon. Jeff Bezos does not need to fly another phallic rocket to the moon, but our independent bookstores are our hubs of our community. And thank you so much to all of you for giving up a little bit of your time to come and listen to me chat about the work of our charity and some of the projects that we're doing. I hope that it's that everybody finds it useful and interesting. As Yadvinda mentioned, I'm here to talk about my book, Our Oaken Bones, but really it's about more than just the book. The kind of the three subtitles of the book are about reviving a family, and I want to talk a little bit about the human restorative and mental health benefits of some of our wilder spaces, especially here in the UK, when we don't often think of the UK as being a place blessed with much wilderness, but we are still just. To talk a bit about reviving a farm and some of the issues that we face around British agriculture at the moment and the changes it's going through in this post-Brexit, post-EU landscape, and also about our ancient rainforests, a term that until relatively recently, I think most of us, or many of us, probably wouldn't have been familiar with the idea that Britain has rainforests and that we are a rainforest people living on a rainforest island. But it's wonderful to see the knowledge and understanding and love of this very culturally relevant habitat coming back. And I'm keen to talk a bit about that. I aim to talk for about half an hour and then to answer any questions. And I'd love to answer any questions that anybody may have. So I drove up this morning, and I'm driving back this evening to this valley on Bodmin Moor in Cornwall. So this is the Kabila Valley, which is in the southwestern area of Bodmin Moor, which is down in Cornwall. And it's a farm that is my family farm. My father started farming it in 1960. I was born and brought up on the farm. And it's about a 240-acre upland hill farm, which I think is quite relevant to some of the conversations or what we're going to talk about today, because many of the farms that are seen as sites of nature restoration, often termed rewilding sites or nature conservation sites, are often at really large scale, and they might be interesting from a research perspective, but they're not very accessible for the average farmer and landowner. Now, the average size of farm in the UK is 210 acres, so this 240-acre site is very relevant and applicable to what about 75% of the UK tends to be, these smaller farms, upland farms especially. And it's a 240-acre upland hill farm, which is about 1/3 ancient woodland, so about 80 acres of ancient woodland, then about 2/3, 160 acres of grade 4 grazing land, which is one of the poorest types of farmland that we have in the UK. You can't really grow much in the way of crops there. It's traditionally used for things like sheep predominantly, and maybe a few cattle, some ponies, at a very low density. So it's not very it's not very good farmland for high intensity farming. And I grew up on this farm, spending most of my time in this ancient woodland, playing in the valley, swimming in the river, building dens and climbing trees. And that was my childhood. I felt very lucky to be able to grow up there. And when I left school when I was 18, I joined the British Army. And I, again, felt very lucky to join the military at a time when our army was very busy. This is in the early noughties, when our army was quite heavily involved in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And every soldier hopes to join the military at a time when they're going to go and do something, even if those wars turn out to be broadly completely illegal. And I found myself quite quickly deployed on 3 sort of 6 to 7 month long combat tours of Afghanistan. And on the first of these, I was blown up in a Taliban-laid roadside bomb, and was very, very lucky that I survived and that my crew and my vehicle physically survived. And I remember at the time, we went through some very basic mental health training back in the UK before we went out to Afghanistan. And I remember being told at the time that if you were unlucky enough to go through some kind of traumatic incident, it could take up to 10 years for the effects of that to manifest psychologically and for you to start to suffer from a mental health condition. And I remember as definitely a very naive, probably quite arrogant 21-year-old army officer thinking, don't be so ridiculous. If something happens to me that I'm going to be affected by, I'll know immediately, or at least within the week, or within a month at the outside. It's not going to take any longer than that. And it was almost 10 years to the day from being blown up in Afghanistan after I'd left the army and was living and working in London that I had a mental health breakdown in 2017 and was diagnosed with complex PTSD. And a lot of that, I think, came from that incident in Afghanistan, but it's also worth noting, living and working in London, that I'm sure a lot of that came from the kind of pressures and stresses that a lot of, especially the younger generation, have put through in the current corporate cycle and grind of high intensity urban living. And I went through the traditional NHS healing process, but I also was very lucky to have this valley and this farm that my parents were still living on that I could go back to and hide within this forest amongst the oaks and lie in the river and climb the trees and start to begin to heal and restore back within nature, and began to feel myself returning to maybe not who I had been before, but certainly a form of person that I felt I could move forward with mental health challenges that had grown from my time in Afghanistan. And it was at about this time in 2017, 2018, that my wife Lizzie and I were trying to start a family. And she was going through issues which I think are far too common and far too little discussed. And she had a number of quite traumatic late stage miscarriages when we were trying to begin a family. And for her, this valley, this forest became a really important place of both physical and psychological healing that she could return to as well. And then it was a year or two after this, in early 2020, when my father, who lived with us at the time and was an 83-year-old explorer, was diagnosed quite early on with COVID-19. And he became very ill very quickly. And we phoned for an ambulance, and they came along and took his blood oxygen, and it had dropped to the early 80s, the low 80s. And they said that his lips had gone blue and he was really struggling to breathe. And they rushed him off to Derriford Hospital in Plymouth, where a doctor phoned us up and said, you need to be aware, we know very little about this disease at the moment. Your father's in his mid-80s. At his age and in his condition, he has a very low chance of surviving. They put it at about 20% chance of surviving. And they said, but what we're going to do is we're going to put him into an induced coma, put a tube into his lungs, intubate him, and we're going to keep him in that coma for a week in the hope that he might pull through, but his lungs are filling up with fluid very quickly. And so they put him into an induced coma for 7 weeks in the end, and his lungs filled with fluid, his kidneys failed, he had secondary infections across his body. And the doctors, they're not allowed to phone you up and tell you that someone is definitely going to die. But they told us everything that you can tell someone up to that point. They said effectively we had to make our peace with the fact we would never see him again because we couldn't go to the hospital in the middle of COVID, but that he wasn't coming home. They then said that because of this, they were going to take him off the medication, switch off the machines, remove the tube and let him slip away. So they did this and he began to wake up. And a doctor phoned us and said, frankly, this is quite miraculous. We weren't expecting him to wake up, but you also need to be very cognizant of what this means. He's highly unlikely to be restored to full cognitive function, definitely not to full physical function. He'll probably be wheelchair bound for the rest of his life, possibly bed bound, and need round the clock care. And his life is probably going to be quite short from now on because he's been through a hell of a lot at his age. And he'll need to stay in hospital for the next 6 months while he goes through physiotherapy and occupational therapy before we can even consider sending him home. And you'll need to kit your home out with all sorts of equipment to help him. They then phoned us back 3 days later and said, would you please come and collect him? He's really irritating. He kept pulling all of his tubes out and trying to climb out of bed. And so we took him home, and he was a shadow of his former self. And we plonked him down in this woodland, in this valley, and left him there for a couple of months to heal because he was being quite irritating. And he began to come back to both psychological and physical strength. And he set himself this challenge. He said he'd been sent to Plymouth Hospital, which had a healing intensive care garden that people could be wheeled into even when they were sedated. And he put a lot of his healing down to being back in nature, feeling the sun on his face, breathing in the scent of flowers and of the natural world. And Cornwall only has one hospital, Treliske, which didn't at that time have an intensive care garden. And he set himself the challenge of climbing Cornwall's highest point, our great mountain, Brown Willy, unaided, 5 months after coming home from COVID, to raise money to build an intensive care garden at Treliske. And he did this, and he raised £150,000, and Treliske now has a healing garden. And to put that into context, he last year rode the entire length of the Tamar to raise money for our charity. And next month, he's rowing from Oxford to London. He turns 90 on Thursday in order to raise money as well. So he's a good example of how you can just be very stubborn. It's basically his mark on life. But we had these 3 remarkable healing stories for us personally as a family. Mine after Afghanistan, my wife's after going through a number of challenges with her fertility journey, and my father's coming back from COVID. And it led us down led me down an obsessive pathway of trying to establish what was special about a habitat like this that was helping us to heal and might help others to heal as well. And I mentioned at the start that it's ancient woodland, and I'm not a dendrologist or a botanist. I didn't really know what that meant. And so I started to try and understand what we mean by these terms. And we call a woodland in the UK ancient if it's been around since the year 1600. So if it's 400 years old or older, then it's ancient. And when you think that our paramount ancient woodland tree is the oak tree, a tree which can live for 1,000 years, these incredibly long-lived organisms, and we're saying to 1,000-year organisms that a 400-year-old woodland is ancient, it's like saying to a room full of 20-year-olds that they're all OAPs. It doesn't really bear much ecological sense. But we knew that this was at least 400 years old, this woodland. And I then found working with the Ancient Tree Forum, found all of the doomsday records from 1086 and mapping every 50 to 100 years since then that showed that this forest had been extant since 1086, which meant that it was 1,000 years old, which already began to put it in quite a rare category, because we've cut down 98% of our ancient woodland, and woodland that's 1,000 years old is even rarer in the UK. And then we started to partner with the Eden Project, who sent a wonderful team of soil scientists into the valley who did a paleobotanical peat core survey, where they basically get a giant corkscrew and screw it down into the ground. And when they bring it up, they look at the pollen record at every millimeter and can see what the land use was like for a long, long period back. And these guys are proper scientists, and I'm certainly not. So I was being very impatient with them. And I'm sure many of you will be familiar with people being impatient with you while you're doing your research. And I was prodding them and pushing them and saying, look, I really want to know, is this forest 1,000 years old? Is it 1,100 years old? Might it be 1,200 years old? And I eventually took the lead scientist, Mark, out for a pint and slightly twisted his arm and lost my temper with him and said, Mark, I really want to know, it's been 4 or 5 months now, how old is this forest? And we're good friends, but he lost his temper with me and he said, fine, I'll tell you what I know. I want to be far more specific, and I wanted to drill down into the data in a more granular way. But all I can tell you with the level of data crunching we've done at the moment is that this forest is at least 3,664 years old, give or take 29 years. I said, Mark, that will do. That's specific enough. He said, it's probably far older, but that's as deep as our core would go. So you can probably comfortably say you have 4,000 years of continuous growth, death, and recycling within this valley, which makes it a remarkably rare and ancient habitat. And it was at about this time, 3-4 years ago, that people started to use this term Atlantic temperate rainforest or British rainforests. And we began to realize and have demonstrated to us that what we have in this valley, this 80 acres of ancient woodland, is actually a very remarkably healthy and intact example of that habitat. And we did an assessment with the Woodland Trust last year, where they looked at every fragment of rainforest they could find west of Bristol, several hundred sites, and they marked them all, graded them all on a 1 to 9 basis, 1 being in a very unhealthy state, 9 being in a very healthy condition of rainforest. And this is the only level 9 rainforest west of Bristol. So it's in a good condition as far as that habitat goes. Oh, God, flipping ahead there. All of these photographs were taken in the Kabila Valley. So these are all of this forest. And I love to remind people that even if you weren't necessarily familiar with the term Atlantic temperate rainforest, you will be familiar with that habitat from the stories from our childhood and our folklore, because these are Geoffrey of Monmouth's Arthurian legends where knights would meet to do battle. They are Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky, the Mabinogion, or Tolkien's Fangorn Forest, where Ents roam from glade to glade. They are where most of our ancient stories are set, certainly within the British Isles. And just because we weren't using this term rainforest doesn't mean it isn't a very relevant habitat and ecosystem type. But it also has a very specific designation. One element of which, of course, is the amount of rainfall you receive. So to be designated rainforest, an area of woodland needs to have at least 1,400 millimeters of rainfall every year. And that can't all fall within one monsoon season within sort of December and January. It needs to fall a little bit in every month throughout the year, which for anyone who's ever been on holiday in Cornwall will know is pretty much guaranteed that it will rain at some point, if not for all of the time that you're staying. So we get a lot of rainfall. And that's also within a system of native trees. And it's something that I think we're very poor at in the UK as an island, is about identifying what species here are native and what's been introduced, what is non-native. When you go to other island habitats like New Zealand or Australia, they're very objective and very quick to go, well, these rabbits were introduced, they're non-native, they're very damaging to our ecosystem health. Or in Australia, these cane toads are not from here and are damaging habitats and the integrity of these ecosystems. Whereas in the UK, we often confuse non-native and native trees, and especially with other types of fauna as well as flora. The number of arguments I've had with people about whether grey squirrels are good for our woodlands is frankly ridiculous. But so it's native woodland environment, generally with an oak overstory with hazel, rowan, and willow as your ruderal or mid-story species, and then bluebells, wood rush, and bilberry at your ground story. And that high level of rainfall I mentioned really helps to support the epiphytes, which is what really designates these temperate rainforests. Along with the level of rainfall is the content of your epiphytes up in your canopy. And epiphytes are just any plants that don't use the soil to grow. So that's lichens, bryophytes, mosses, polypody ferns, liverworts, pennyworts, all of these things that grow up within the canopy that mean that these habitats are effectively layers upon layers upon layers of life. And then you also find within this usually a very high level of fungal life or mycological life. And within that, you have this mycorrhizal network, which connects all these trees together, especially in these ancient habitats. We find the surveys that have been done within our rainforest, the level of mycorrhizal fungi within the rainforest itself is quite literally off the scale. There is a scale they use to measure this. We are off that scale because there is such a high level of mycorrhizal fungus. And increasingly that's being demonstrated to not just pass resources between the trees of sugars and water and other nutrients, but also electrical signals as trees are able to share information about what's happening around them, whether they're being attacked by a certain blight or a certain insect type, to enable those around them in their community to prepare their defenses against that. And I'm sure many people will be familiar with the work of Dr. Susan Simard at the University of British Columbia, who's really pioneering a lot of that research. And what I love to sort of remind people is that what that means is that when we walk through the majority of the woodland that we have in the UK, which is often non-native or monoculture or definitely very young, what you're really walking through is a big patch of mud with 10,000 trees planted in the ground. But when you walk through a 4,000-year-old Atlantic temperate rainforest like we have in this valley, you're really walking over one giant mushroom with 10,000 fingers all pointing up in the sky, all in constant communication, collaboration, and conversation with one another. And it makes these terrifically diverse, riotous, cacophonous habitats that have a huge amount of entomological, but also of all kinds of life, from bird life to the small mammalian life, even things like reptiles and amphibians. The surveys that we're doing there is showing that these are really wonderful sites for all kinds of diversity and abundance. But it's not just exciting from a storytelling perspective. The work, and I'll come on to talk a bit more about the work of our charity, but we're really focused upon conducting scientific research and enabling scientific research within this habitat to demonstrate that it's very important from a number of scientific perspectives as well. So at a time of climate crisis, when we are failing to meet any of the climate targets that are being set, certainly nationally, if not globally, this habitat, Atlantic temperate rainforest, is able to sequester as much carbon as pretty much any other terrestrial habitat that we can restore. Things like peat are wonderful carbon stores. Seagrass is a very quick way of restoring a carbon store, but temperate rainforest, not only because of the density of the trees, but because of the epiphytes growing within the canopy, mean that we have a multiplication effect of the amount of CO2 that is sucked out of the atmosphere and locked into the forest floor. And that high fungal density within the forest floor is also acting as an incredible carbon store as well. So it's brilliant as a tool in the fight against climate change, and especially to create a localized effect at a national level. We're also the second most nature depleted country in Europe, much to our shame. The winning country is Malta, an island which is 85% developed, and we are second to Malta as a formerly rainforested island. So we've destroyed so much of our natural habitats, and nothing restores that biodiversity abundance more effectively and more quickly than Atlantic temperate rainforest. Everything across the trophic system, from meso and even apex predators down through some of your ecosystem engineers like beavers and other creatures that can be restored, and then down to the kind of the insects, the mushrooms, and the plant life that we see. Square foot by square foot, temperate rainforest is a very effective way to restore this habitat. But for me, what always resonated most closely, and I hope will resonate with some of you as well, is that this is a pinnacle habitat for the mental health and well-being of the humans who spend time amongst it. So as these rainforests photosynthesize, they suck CO2 out of the air and they pump out oxygen, but they lace that oxygen with volatile organic compounds. And there's more and more research happening around the world around the physiological and psychological impacts of these VOCs on human physiology and psychology. So spending just 30 minutes in a rainforest like Kabila, and your cortisol level, your main stress hormone, drops to a level that can still be measured up to 2 weeks later. They boost kidney function, improve immune system response, and help to put us from our sympathetic nervous state, our fight or flight, that we all evolved to spend very small amounts of time in, and now, because of the stresses of modern living, often spend large amounts of time residing in our sympathetic nervous states. And they help us to move into our parasympathetic, our rest and digest, our state of homeostasis. So I really believe that at a time of a mental health pandemic in the Western world, nature collapse across multiple European countries, and a climate crisis, this habitat should be viewed as a vital tool in the fight against all three. This is a map of the bioclimatic envelope across the mainland of the British Isles, and would have once demonstrated where our temperate rainforests we would have had a rainforest landscape probably about 3,000 years ago. So everywhere from Stornoway on the Isle of Lewis, down the Western Highlands from Mallaig to Fort William to Oban, and then places like Cumbria in the Lake District, and then that western belt of Wales from Anglesey to Aberystwyth to Pembrokeshire, and then down in the southwest, Exmoor, Dartmoor, Bodmin Moor, the Lizard and West Penwith. These would have been our central cores of rainforest, our rainforest nodes that would have formed a rainforest landscape that stretched across that whole Celtic fringe on the west of the UK. That doesn't mean we would have had closed canopy rainforest across that. The old myth that once upon a time a squirrel could have gone from Land's End to John O'Groats without touching the ground has been pretty effectively debunked. We would have had a patchwork, a mosaic of lots of different habitats, but along that western belt, it would have predominantly been rainforest-led, or sort of a paramount rainforest with all these other habitats throughout it. So if this is what it would have looked like sort of 3,500 years ago, this is what it looks like now. So we've removed about 98% of that habitat. And I think that's a useful comparison. If you think that when I say the word rainforest, most of us will think of the tropical variety. We've cut down 50% around about of the world's tropical rainforests, but we've cut down over 98% of our temperate rainforests, to the extent that we've even lost that cultural identity that comes with that in most of the tropical rainforest zone is still maintained and held. And whilst 3,000 years might seem like a ridiculously long time to us humans with our short lifespans, that's only 3 generations of an oak tree's lifespan. So it's actually a remarkably small amount of time when you consider it within that broader context. Now, the reason that our rainforest went from being 20% of the mainland of the British Isles down to about 0.4% as they are now is really threefold. The first one is of course, as always, us humans. In exactly, or in a very similar way, that farmers are being encouraged in places like Brazil to use slash and burn deforestation techniques in pristine tropical rainforest to create very poor pasture land for cattle, which is an entirely non-native species to South America, just so that we can have our McDonald's. In the same way, over the last 3,000 years, farmers have been pushed into these fringes and encouraged into these upland areas to deforest these pristine temperate rainforests to make very poor pasture land as well. So we removed the temperate rainforest, and then there are a number of species that are preventing its restoration. Deer is a big one of these across the UK. We have 6 different deer varieties in the UK. 4 of them are exotics, they're non-native. They were brought here either because we thought they were pretty or we wanted to hunt them. And that's fallow sika, Chinese water deer, and muntjac. The two that are native, red deer and roe, and that's a roebuck chewing. It's a brilliant photograph of a roebuck chewing on an oak leaf. Red deer and roe deer are both native to the UK, native to our rainforest landscape, but way outside of the carrying capacity of what we should ever expect to see across our landscape. So just to take roe deer as an example, the Forestry Commission think that the healthy carrying capacity of the British Isles for roe deer is about 350,000 animals, and that currently we may have as many as 1.4 million roaming through our woodlands. And to a roe deer, an oak sapling is like a Frere Rocher just lying on the forest floor. They'll just come through and hoover them up. And without any of the usual pressures of apex predators to keep them moving and make them live in a landscape of fear, they have no reason not to move on. They feed and feed and feed and breed and breed and breed, and their numbers are exploding. So we have a big problem with deer pressure. And it's something that I think we need to be far better at in the UK. It's far cheaper at the moment in the UK to buy venison sourced from New Zealand than it is to buy venison sourced from 5 miles down the road in our own landscape. And that is a shocking, shocking fact that we should all be fighting to change. And the other is sheep, which is in many ways a much more loaded subject, because sheep have this cultural connection to the landscape. Every postcard that you see of Cumbria or of Cornwall or of Wales, if it doesn't have sheep on it, it certainly should. They're a completely ubiquitous animal across our uplands. I have two daughters who are at the local primary school, where on the wall there is a cow that goes moo, a horse that neighs, a pig that oinks, and a sheep that bars. These animals we learn from our youngest years are a part of our life here. And when I moved back full-time to Kabila, this 240-acre farm, of which 160 acres is farmable and the rest is woodland, I spoke to a number of farm advisors and agricultural consultants, and they all had the same advice. They all said, well, the first thing you need to do is cut down that stuff. That's rubbish. Cut down that woodland. And this is the advice that farmers have been given for the last 2,000 years, is if you take, in grazing land especially, if you take over a farm and some of it is workable farmland and some of it is woodland, get rid of the woodland as quickly as you can and just have farmland, because that's your economies of scale. You can have more sheep, more meat, more wool on that land, and therefore you might be able to make a viable business model off the back of it. Having had the healing experience I'd had within that forest, for me this felt morally wrong, but I had to find out if financially and from a food security perspective it was wrong as well. So at that time I started to look more deeply into the economics behind putting sheep on these landscapes. So the first thing I looked at was actually where sheep are. And as you can see from a sheep density map of Europe, everything they say about the Welsh is true. And about Yorkshire and Lancashire and the southwest. And the Sardinians seem to love sheep as well. But these are all islands. And as I mentioned before, island ecology is so fragile, and it's so important that the animals that we have at high densities within these landscapes come from them. Now, if you compare sheep densities in Europe, which you can see here, with the evolutionary range of the sheep. So Ovis ares, the original sheep, is a Mesopotamian, Persian, Turkish, and Balkan animal, a desert and scrubland creature that over the last 4,000 years has been imported and traded up into the British Isles, because back when larger livestock was quite wild and quite hard to transport, the sheep has always been quite an easily tradable creature along the very, very far western tail end of the old Silk Road routes, or the old trading transhumance routes. And so the sheep isn't technically a native creature to the UK. It's been brought here and bred to a point where it just about survives. And any sheep farm will tell you a sheep's favorite hobby is dying in any time of the year in any landscape. And that's because it is a desert creature with hard desert hooves that compact the soil, with bitter desert manure that isn't good for our gentle western soils, and with a voracious desert appetite. So it eats everything it can whenever it can. So the sheep are not from the UK, but that doesn't matter if they're an important part of our rural economy, our rural community, and our food security system. So the next thing I looked at was the economy behind this. So there's a reason why this seems quite out of date in 2018, and that's because, if you remember, we voted to leave the European Union in 2016, but we lived in a no man's land until 2020 when we actually left. And so we had this 4-year period where we knew we were going to lose all of those European subsidies, but we hadn't lost them yet. And this is the amount of subsidy that was paid from Brussels under the Common Agricultural Policy to British farmers in 2018. And down in the southwest where I live, about £450 million a year was being paid predominantly to sheep farmers just to help them keep farming in that way. I found an NFU report from 2018 that said that the average upland hill farmer on Bodmin Moor and Dartmoor was taking between 85 and 92% of their annual income from European subsidies. 9/10 of what farmers around me were earning was a handout from Brussels. It was a social payment, not an agricultural subsidy, just to keep them farming. And then I found this Financial Times report at the same time that showed, there isn't a test at the end of this, I promise, this is the last graph I'll show you, that showed, so the dark blue here is the amount of money that a farmer can make by farming type, and the light blue is the amount of subsidy that is paid to them to top it up so they can continue farming. Now, if you farm chickens, poultry, it's very, very profitable. This is why the River Wye has no life in it now. If you're a horticulture or a general cropping or an arable farmer, there's money in it. But if you're grazing livestock on the uplands, as you can see here, that's all debt. And then the subsidy is all that keeps these farmers alive. And we knew as soon as we voted to leave the European Union that that subsidy would be ceasing. And it is now just finishing this year, the last few payments before we switch to a British subsidy system, which is far more at the whim of whoever happens to be in government at the time. So it didn't seem like it was a very financially viable model for our landscapes. And then I also read at the same time that whilst we use about 22% of UK farmland for sheep farming, it provides approximately 1% of our calories as a nation. So whereas things like chicken, beef, pork, and certainly cereal crops are a staple as part of our food security, lamb is not part of our staple food security system. Nobody eats lamb on a daily basis for their calorific intake. It's generally a luxury or an occasional meat that is eaten. And so it isn't necessarily part of our rural economy or our food security. And it certainly isn't creating an ecological benefit either. So when we took the farm over, we decided to try something a little bit different. So my wife Lizzie and I, we started our business, Cornwall, which is a wellness retreat centre where we wanted to bring people into the rainforest in a considered and delicate way so that they could benefit in exactly the same way that we'd been able to benefit from that habitat. So we focused on bringing veterans groups and have brought many groups of former soldiers, sailors, and airmen into the rainforest to heal on these 3-day-long retreats. We formed a partnership with the NHS, sending in nurses who are suffering from stress and burnout, and many wellness groups for corporate professionals who needed to kind of step away from urban living for a while. And we ran these 3-day retreats that would focus on things like movement practices, yoga, Pilates, forest bathing, breath work, sound therapy, cold water immersion, and other kind of embodied practices to help people try and heal in this habitat. And to this day, we've run about 168 of these 3-day retreats. We've run 168 of these 3-day retreats and had about 4,500 people come and stay in the forest. And I judge everything based upon what I call the tier rate, which is the number of people I can convert into having a positive emotional outpouring while they're staying. And we run at about a 65% tier rate of people who break down into floods of tears while they're staying. My favorite are the veterans groups of big roughy tufty soldiers who don't want to share their emotions and then break down in tears after a day or two. And I'm trying to get that up to about 80% is where I'll be happy when that's the number that have these kind of really releasing experiences that I think we all need to have far more often. But this was our way of sharing the rainforest with people. But I also wanted to make sure at the same time we were restoring the habitat and creating a viable farm business model. Because I think we have far too much of a binary approach to nature restoration in the UK, where we either consider areas as being for humans, like National Trust properties, where we pave over with concrete and gravel all the pathways and people are pushing prams and getting nice swanky coffees, but we sacrifice nature. Or we make an area for nature and we do things like rewilding, where the idea is that it's just for nature, humans aren't invited, fence it off and keep humans out. And I think both of these models don't necessarily work. I wanted to try and create a model where we could incentivize farmers to restore nature, bring more people into the landscape, but also see the rainforest and other habitats return. And that was when 4 years ago I founded our charity, the 1,000 Year Trust, which is to this day the only charity in the UK solely dedicated to the restoration and research of our Atlantic temperate rainforest habitats. And the idea was that we would use the site at Kabila, which you can see here just in the southwestern edge of Bodmin Moor, as a blueprint site to demonstrate on an averagely sized farm how you can restore rainforest, bring people onto the land, and also create a financially viable model for the landowning farmer. And you can see here the red rim that goes around the farm. And here's the ancient rainforest in the heart of it that all advisors were saying, cut this down if you want to have a viable farm, get rid of as many trees as possible. And our model now over the next 50 years of the farm at Kabila looks like this. So we've restored approximately 100,000 trees over that landscape, all in a native woodland mixture, a rainforest mixture, about 60% oak, with the remainder being your kind of standard native ruderal or mid-canopy species. But it's in this system of glades and rides, and I like to think of this as the reticulated python eating 100 hamsters. And what that creates is a mob grazing system that you can put a low density native breed mixture through of things like native breed cattle, ponies, and pigs. And by passing through this, the animals benefit massively. They get shade in the summer, they get shelter in the winter, they get additional forage throughout the year, which reduces how prone they'll be to degradation and disease. But also the woodland and the trees will benefit as well from not only the manure of these native creatures that have evolved to have manure that works in a cycle with the soil and the land, but also the trees benefit from coppicing, from grazing, from brashing, from dust bowling and dominance displays, all things of which are very beneficial to things like your amphibian species and also your mycelial content in the soil. It needs the interaction of large herbivores. We've entered into this weird world where we think of farmland as being lots of green fields with large animals and no trees, and we think of woodland as being lots of trees with no large animals. And actually the two should be layered one on top of the other in much more of an agroforestry approach for the health of the animals, the health of the woodland and the trees, but also the health of the meat that comes out of it, because it's still a farmed landscape. And the other thing that's exciting about this is, for many people in various ecological disciplines, what's really exciting about these landscapes isn't actually the closed canopy forest or the open grassland or peatland. It's the edge habitat that surrounds it. It's the area where you transition from one type of landscape into another, because that's where all the pollination, the predation, the interaction of different animals happens. And by having this system that runs through the middle, we've moved from 7 kilometers of edge around the traditional farm to 28 kilometers of edge by having this system of glades and rides, which just slingshots the opportunity that the natural world can have. And this is what much of Kabila currently looks like. I fought with the Forestry Commission to have tree tubes made out of wool or mycelial fungus, which you can get now, and are brilliant because they last about 3 years and they rot down into the ground and feed the trees. But the Forestry Commission was adamant, only plastic will do. And so now we have about 40,000 plastic tubes to collect in the next few years, which is going to be the next fun challenge. But before I finish and take any questions, I wanted to talk about the thing that I've really become very focused on over the last few years, and that is around why, when I say the word, when any of us say the word rainforest, do we all immediately think of tropical rainforests of the Amazon rather than thinking of our British rainforests? And the reason for that is because all of us, pretty much anyone around the world who's had any form of formal education, has grown up hearing about tropical rainforests, about the Amazon being the lungs of the planet, and learning about them at school. And the reason we've learned about them at school is because they're so well studied and researched, and that research has filtered down into the school curriculums and government policy at every level. There are probably 10,000 scientists right now doing highly important multi-year, multidisciplinary research in the world's tropical rainforests. And that's wonderful. And you can see here just how much comparatively research is being done in tropical rainforests compared to temperate rainforests, especially in Europe and in the UK. It is absolutely tiny in comparison. If you're a young conservation scientist just finishing your studies and you want to have a career in rainforest research, you're almost certainly going to do that in tropical rainforests. And that makes a huge amount of sense. Not only is there far more tropical rainforests, but there are also hundreds of universities with courses dedicated to tropical rainforest research. There are dozens of research institutes that provide millions of pounds of funding every year for tropical rainforest research. And I think most importantly, there are also dozens of research field stations where as a scientist, you can go out to Peru, Belize, Bolivia, Brazil, the Congo Basin, Borneo, and join multi-year, multidisciplinary research programs, be mentored by experienced professors, contribute to peer-reviewed papers, burnish your career, influence government policy, and feed into school curriculums. And that is why we all know how important tropical rainforests are. If you want to make your career in Atlantic temperate rainforest, there isn't a single university course dedicated to that habitat. There isn't a single research institute providing regular funding to the research of that habitat. And there aren't any research field stations where you can go and actually do that work. And it means that our British rainforests are starved of the attention that they need. They're starved of the study that needs to demonstrate the data, to bash our politicians over the head so that they pass laws to protect them and provide funding to protect them. And they're not really talked about enough in our school curriculums, even in the UK, let alone around the world, so that nobody even knows that Britain is a rainforest island and that we are a rainforest people who live upon it. So we at the Thousand Year Trust are building Europe's first Atlantic temperate rainforest research field station, a home for scientists, academics, researchers, journalists, maybe even the occasional well-behaved politician, to be able to come into the heart of one of the last ancient rainforests in the UK and be able to actually conduct this research, be able to really understand this habitat, be able to unlock it. And my hope is, and also as you can see here, you know, we'll have areas where school groups, you know, artistic groups, actors, artists can come together to really tell the stories around this habitat as well, so that it's a place that's accessible to local community. Farming groups can come here and understand about our landscape recovery program, which, you know, we're using that blueprint at Kabila of the Kabila Valley. We're now working with 16 different farmers over about 8,000 acres to begin to implement this model across a much larger landscape on Bodmin Moor. And this will become the headquarters, the heart, the beating hub of that work. And with all of that happening, with this science being conducted and the community having a space to come to as well, my dream is that we may be able to turn this landscape, which we've all grown up thinking of this being the most natural and normal way for the uplands to be. And actually much of this would once, just a few thousand years ago, have looked a bit more like that. And maybe we shouldn't turn all of it back from one to the other, but there's space for both. And maybe there's a space where we can turn some of it back into this and create a more resilient financial landscape, a more resilient ecological landscape, and a more resilient community as well. Thank you very much. I'd love to answer any questions that anyone might have about any of that. Yeah.
Thank you, Merlin. Terrific. And we can open up for questions now with plenty of time, and also there might be something online.
It's a very warm room. Well done, everybody, for staying awake. And normally in warm rooms like this, I see the first head pull back after about half an hour.
Yeah, I found this whole concept immensely appealing, and I just wondered what proportion of the British Isles would be capable of supporting this sort of rainforest,
Temperate rainforest.
temperate rainforest. Because I know there's quite a lot of research that shows that mosses of the epiphytic sort require it to be sort of warm and wet. And once you get over towards the more eastern side of the British Isles, it doesn't work like that. So can you characterize where you could have?
Yes, so as that map showed earlier on, with it all down the western kind of belt, it is predominantly those Celtic fringes, that western range, and that's mainly because the majority of our weather comes off the Atlantic, and so our western areas receive more rainfall. But it isn't ever as simple as that. I get a lot of emails from people and letters from people in Kent or in Yorkshire saying, I think we have rainforests, you know, near us.
Right,
and you go, yeah, of course, because certain valleys will gather more moisture and more condensation, and then there'll be certain areas in the west that don't get enough. And so whilst once about 20% of the UK, so about 20% of the UK is appropriate for temperate rainforest, and we're down now to about 0.4, 0.5% of what we have remaining to us. I think if we can just return it up to 2, 3%, we'd be making a huge impact on our climate resilience, our biodiversity abundance, and beautiful spaces for people to spend time. But I also think, and it's a debate I often have with my favorite people who are lichenologists, the true kind of deep specialists in this area, and we often have debates about how long it will take. And there's a reason I call the charity a 1,000-year trust, and it's because we have to have the patience of the full life cycle of an oak tree. But at the same time, I don't think we should be shy as humans to view ourselves as a keystone species and an ecosystem engineer and assist in the re-establishment. We often think of tree planting as the job that we humans can do, but actually we have a live research project that is beginning at the 1,000-year Trust, using, in fact, Harrison here is leading on it, using ropes to grow lichens and epiphytes and bryophytes as a way of studying how we can grow them in a controlled environment on this living roof of the research station, and then how we can get them to colonize into young kind of cadet rainforest, so that we don't just plant trees and go, well, it might take 200 years now for the lichens to return to this habitat. We plant trees and then we help the lichens and the mosses and certain mushroom species to return, so that we can accelerate that process and we can be a part of the solution, not just plant the trees and sit back and wait. And so I think there's elements of human assistance that can be helpful.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Do you have fences to keep the deer out?
Fences will never be the solution, I don't think, to any problem. We do. So we for a while in the 80s, we were a deer farm. We had 2,000 red deer on the farm. So that at one point there were 30 kilometers of deer fencing that went around our farm, which makes it the perfect way to demonstrate how fences don't work, because we have 30 kilometers of deer fencing and deer everywhere. I think fences are often seen as a way to assist in nature restoration, either by excluding certain species or keeping certain species in. But fences are always short term. When we put fences in the early 80s, all of the fence posts were dipped in arsenic so that they didn't get wood rot. And that's why they're still standing now. It's now considered to be quite bad for the water table to have all your fence posts dipped in arsenic. And so now fence posts don't have that, which means that in a temperate rainforest bioclimatic envelope where it's very wet, your fence post will last about 8 years, and fencing will cost about £20 a meter. So when you think if you're going to fence a 7-kilometer perimeter at £20 a meter, and it's only going to last 8 years, that's a constant drain of resources that could be used for other purposes. And also, whilst fencing may exclude the animals you want to exclude, it won't exclude all of them. Deer are amazingly good at getting around, under, through, or over fencing, and you're also preventing the movement of other species. So we do have fencing, but I would like to see a landscape with far fewer fences in the UK, because they not only destroy the landscape appeal and the accessibility for other people, but I think they're very damaging to natural migratory patterns.
Sorry, Merlin, I got 3 questions, but they are slightly related. The first one is, there would have been lots of demand on that oak since 1086. Do you know why it wasn't deforested? And have you researched into not only your family history, but the previous owners as to why they didn't deforest that? Because there would have been demand, Napoleonic Wars, and making money. On the money thing, because
can I do each one? Otherwise, I'll forget.
Of course you can. Yeah.
Thank you, Ed. It's very kind. So you're absolutely right. And the majority of our ancient woodland was lost in the Napoleonic era, when it would take up to 6,000 mature oak trees to make a single ship of the line. So a lot of our oak woodland, our ancient woodland, was destroyed back when we were building ships as quickly as we could to go and conquer our empire or defend the lands that we had. And the reason that the temperate rainforest especially, so most temperate rainforest in the southwest grows out of granite, out of what's called a clitter batholith. So you have these geological formations which are very, very hard to access. Predominantly, they have been protected by topographical reasons, just because it's bloody hard to get in there to cut it down. And then you see the same in places like in Western Wales, where it's mainly slate, and where you get broken slate at an angle, it's really hard to get in there to extract it, which is why Welsh rainforest survived. And then in the Scottish Highlands, it's the same, just because of it being very remote and distant. So these are fringe areas that were just uneconomical to extract. And it's very similar to what we're seeing in the North Sea at the moment, where the price of oil will depend upon whether it's economically viable to extract North Sea gas or oil. In the same way, the price of oak would fluctuate and would depend whether it was worth going to these fringe areas to pull out the last few trees. So the main ones that have survived are because they're really hard to access.
Tricky. Then on the money side, are you able, just with your experience on that farm, because I think ultimately the main question is, how do you put a price tag on this stuff against all the other competing interests? How valuable is a tree? What price tag are you going to get put on it? Are you able to give an idea on your farm, the sort of per acre income from farming it in the old way using sheep, without the subsidies, if you can remember that? Then how much you would generate per acre of woodland in the old system before hospitality and leisure. And then, if you don't mind sharing the information, how much you generate on a per acre basis in terms of once you've layered hospitality and leisure on that, just to see how it's transformed the business.
And it's a great question, and it's the most important question, is can you convince farmers that there is more financial resilience in farming rainforest than in farming sheep, is basically the question. And the really hard bit is, what's the delta? Because actually, I think it's totally evident that sheep farming is losing its viability as we've left the basic payment scheme and the common agricultural policy. The huge subsidies that were paid on a headage basis to sheep farmers are going. And the problem is that we have volatility now within the subsidy system, because whereas before we could rely upon Brussels to keep the subsidies pretty steady, because we fundamentally don't enjoy the smell of burning tires as much as our French and German farming cousins, who, as soon as in Europe there was ever a question of reducing farm subsidies, there would be riots, and that wouldn't happen. In the UK, we're never going to have that influence over our politicians, which is why now that farming subsidies sit within the Chancellor of the Exchequer's budget. As soon as the NHS or social care or the military needs more funding, farming subsidies are raided first, because we don't have that influence. So there's a huge volatility over farm subsidies now, which is making farmers very nervous. The average age of a farm in the UK is 62. It has the second highest suicide rate of any industry. And as I said before, the average farmer on Bodmin Moor and Dartmoor was taking up to 9/10 of their income from European subsidies previously. So I believe we're about to enter into a time where we see what we are yet to see in the UK, which is land abandonment, because we have a land value crash in the uplands. We've seen this in much of Europe, in places like some of the areas of Spain, or places like Romania and the Carpathians, where people are abandoning land because you just can't make a living from it. Currently, it costs £1.30 to shear a sheep, and you get paid 25p for the fleece. There is no other industry where something will cost 5 times to get the fleece than you can sell it for, which is why most farmers now are either burning or burying their fleeces, because there's no market in them. So that we currently have a system that is broken. The question is, the two questions I think that are relevant are, is a rainforest restoration model more profitable, more financially resilient and viable, more profitable? And how much does it cost to transition from one to the other? And the transition is the really hard bit, because yes, we can demonstrate. I strip out the hospitality side, because most farmers don't want to do that. So you look at carbon credits, you look at biodiversity net gain, you look at new subsidies, ecosystem service subsidies, and there is more money in restoring rainforest than there is in farming sheep already. The challenge is how you move from one to the other. And that's where we need reliability from our politicians in terms of setting subsidy schemes that are definitely going to be the case for the next 20, 30 years. And none of them are brave enough to do that at the moment.
Final question, sorry. 4,500 people a year, did you say, visiting?
No, over 5 years.
Over 5 years. Okay. Even then, how do you balance? Have you sort of monitored the impact of that access? How do you measure the impact of that potential damage, ruining the magic, putting in the cabins, what the effect is, that type of thing?
Yeah, and I think this is a really live question with the right to roam movement, which is really sort of gathering pace at the moment. And I think that I don't believe we have a right to roam in the UK. I think we have a responsibility to restore. I think that we need to start viewing our relationship with nature as one that is less about observation, one that's more about participation. If we truly are a part of nature, not apart from nature, then being in nature isn't just walking through and capturing content, it's walking through and leaving it in a better state than you found it. And so I think that's a really difficult hill to climb, but a really important one. We've very closely monitored ground flora interruption or interactions in places where we have people passing through. And if there were areas that looked like they were being damaged, then we would exclude those areas, and we have the ability to do that. In a totally right to roam landscape, you don't have the ability to do that anymore, and I think that's quite concerning, because I think we need to encourage people into nature as much as possible, but in a way that doesn't damage it, which is a constant dynamism and a constant tension. And so we've been able to achieve that at Cabilla, but we are down in Cornwall, which is quite a long way away from any large urban centres. I think that when we start to encourage people and help people to have more access to the natural world nearer to urban centres, there'll need to be much more control over how that balance is achieved.
Thank you so much. I'm very interested in this idea of humans as ecosystem engineers, and that lovely diagram you had of the reticulated python consuming the hamsters. Over the centuries, as the ecosystem, as the forest changes, presumably that shape will change as well. A new mosaic will grow. Areas that were open will be forest. Areas that were forest may be open. How do you view that change? Will there be maintenance in the design, or will there be sort of a stepping back and a ceding of agency to the recovering forest? Restoration is such a new science. Are you already seeing some unanticipated changes in the areas you're restoring?
I think we're still quite Thank you for your question. I love the idea that you find the idea of humans as ecosystem engineers is interesting and novel, when I think that we need to force ourselves into a world where we think of humans as being ecosystem engineers is the most natural thing ever. The fact that we've moved to a place where we don't think of ourselves as ecosystem engineers, I find quite concerning, because we are a part of this landscape. We're very much a native species across these all of Western, or all of Europe, all of the world. And there are no landscapes that don't have humans upon them, and we should view ourselves as a force for good, as a force that engineers ecosystems and is a keystone species. So I think you're absolutely right that most people don't think that way. But I think in terms of restoration ecology, we need to view humans as a part of that system. In terms of how much interaction there will be and how much sort of stepping back there'll be, we're quite new to it. And actually, if you look at, I think, some of the restoration models like at NEP, where they have the Wilding narrative and the Wilding book, and it's very much the story of kind of non-intervention nature restoration. Actually, there's a huge amount of interaction with that. They're actively farming that landscape, they're actively managing it, they're actively monitoring it, and I believe that we will be doing that for a very long time. I also think that nature restoration is constantly in a point of dynamism, tension, and flux. So we should never view there being an aspirational end state or a point of equilibrium which equals stasis. We should never go, that's what it should look like, and pause, do that. I think we will always be learning. And I believe that there are really only three levers that we should be pulling as humans. And this is where we need to be brave, but also humble, in terms of how little we understand about the natural world, but also the things that we can do. And in an island landscape like the UK, I think the three things that we should be doing are, if it is native and absent, we should be returning it. And we've seen this, such successes with beavers as a great example, and many other species that are being returned. And there's kind of reverse shifting baseline syndrome, where when we started the beaver journey back in sort of the 20-teens, and everyone was going, oh my God, this is terrible. They're maniacs with chainsaws. They're going to destroy everything. They'll eat all the fish and dam all the rivers and cut down all the trees. And now there are beavers across many, many rivers, and they're generally seen, or in fact entirely seen, to be beneficial. And I think we need to be able to have the same conversations about apex predators and about many of the species that we've lost that we could return. So if it's native and absent, we need to return it. If it's non-native and present, we need to remove it. So things like grey squirrels, things like 4 of our 6 deer species, Rhododendron ponticum, Himalayan balsam, Japanese knotweed. We need to have more of a national conversation about actively removing non-native species from these landscapes. And if it's native, but outside of its carrying capacity or its equilibrium, we need to be a part of restoring it to that level of balance. So that's things like roe deer that are way outside of there, and red deer. So red deer densities in the Highlands of Scotland are currently at 20 deer per square kilometre, and Nature Scott says that they'll only be able to achieve native woodland restoration at 2 deer per square kilometre. They're at 10 times what it will ever work, and yet we have this fear of getting it back to the point that actually might work for the natural world. And that's also the same for things like bracken and bramble and holly and ivy and other species that have been allowed to become dominant because we've removed some of the large herbivores that used to control them. So those are the three things. If it's native and absent, return it. If it's non-native and present, remove it. And if it's native but way outside of its balance, we should be part of returning that balance. And that's how we humans can be a part of that. So I think it's very interventionist, but that's okay because we're a part of this system. We should be interventionists in the same way that a wolf or a beaver should be. I personally believe.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, I thought I was loud enough without this, but hello.
It's for those on Zoom.
Oh, okay. So quick question. In terms of, you mentioned something about the loss of cultural identity, and I think that could be a really good segue into increasing that awareness of temperate rainforests, because you're right, there is a lot of research that's done on tropical rainforests versus temperate. And so I'm wondering, what steps do you think, or would you take in the next few decades to bring back that cultural identity into maybe schools for students, for example, to learn about temperate rainforests as well as tropical, but learn more about temperate rainforests and what we've lost, but the direction of where we're going to go to gain it back. Yeah.
I think it's such that's the area that I find most exciting, because I think there are so many people working in the nature restoration, nature conservation space. I feel like a lot of that work is in train, but I feel like in the UK especially, and much of Western Europe, we have a real reticence in having conversations around cultural identity, indigenous identity, and cultural pride of landscape and place. And we are going through quite rightly, a big reparation and decolonization exercise in the West, and we need to do that. But I think that we mustn't, for want of a better term, throw the baby out with the bathwater and lose all of our sense of place and sense of identity and sense of love of landscape with that. And so I don't have the answer, but I think it's going to be a really exciting journey to establish how we can enter into a state of humility and of becoming more part of a global community that is viewed in terms of equality and in terms of restoring much of the damage that's been done in the last few centuries, but at the same time also be able to have a pride of place that allows us to love our landscapes from a cultural perspective, which you see in places like Brazil or Borneo, where you go and talk to indigenous tribes who live amongst their rainforests, and there's no doubt that they have this wonderful connection and pride of place. And we don't have that in the same way here in the UK. And I think we need to re-establish that. And it will be a slow and gentle process. It can't be an everything everywhere all at once. It needs to be done delicately, but I think it's achievable.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, but first I think we'll wrap up the Q&A now, and there's drinks there. We can carry on the conversation more informally. If I could ask people at the back, when you get up, perhaps move your chairs forward a bit so that people space to all that. And thank you once again. That's really lots of things to read. And look forward to
Thank you.
developing it together.